Welcome to this episode of Strange Process. Today our guest is Angela DeMontigny, fashion designer from Hamilton, Ontario, internationally renowned as an Indigenous fashion designer with collections in Europe and North America. Angela has her flagship store here in Hamilton on James Street North. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming in. This series is just to explore the creative process in a multidisciplinary kind of a way. So I was just wondering if you could reflect. You've said that your work is inspired by the simplicity and the color and the traditions of Indigenous design. And I just wonder how is that a conscious application of these principles, or is this just something that's inherent in the way you work?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. And it's also not only the simplicity of our art, but it's also legends and stories. And, I try to get across or visually embody something that has significance and meaning so people can learn a little bit more about our culture.
So there's a storytelling element to the work that you do?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah? So when there's not a storytelling element, like say I'm just trying to get an idea of how you create, like when it's time to create a new collection, does the collection happen after you've got enough material to put together for a collection, or you decide this year's collection is going to have this theme, or?
Yeah, I decide ahead of time. So it's whatever inspires me. So, I've had collections where, I was inspired by sort of in a plane overlooking a winter landscape of Wyoming in the States, and all the colors, the different hues of, white in the mountains and dark blues, and then the gold colored grasses and things like that. And so that was really about color and then materials, so it's texture and color. Or it's about, floral beadwork might be the inspiration. And so then the colors I choose coordinate with that. Or sometimes it's the material, or it's the leather. So I've done collections based on, beautiful acid washed leathers and 3 different colorways that I've used.
And these inspirations just come to you, like how do you make a decision that this year it's going to be leather, or this year it's going to be beadwork, or is it just?
Well, there's always leather, because that's my main material that I work with. I'm now sort of branching out into doing my own silk designs and things like that, but yeah, it's based on whatever captures my imagination is really what starts the process, and then I start filling in the gaps.
Right. So how long is this process to create a collection?
Sometimes it's really fast.
Is it?
out of necessity. I don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, because the business sort of takes over my life pretty much. The design process seems to get smaller and smaller, so I have to be very focused, and I also have to sort of have an idea of what's happening in the world as far as fashion and what's happening. But I always do my own thing,
in context.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you're working towards deadlines often, are you?
Always.
Always. Oh.
Sometimes really crazy short deadlines, like doing international fashion weeks. So even though it may seem like there's a lot of time in between, but when you've got your, my business and custom orders and, everything else that goes along with it, and then all of a sudden you've got to have a 15-piece capsule collection ready, and the photo shoot and the marketing materials, and it takes a while to, usually I put it all together in about 6 weeks.
Wow.
It's insane.
Is there a large team of people working with you?
Not on a regular basis. I find the team that I need. It's usually myself and my sewer and sample makers, and then I have the production teams for doing the photo shoots and marketing materials.
It's I'm relating that to what we do here as architects. We
Yeah.
have our technical team who
Yeah.
help to to sort of translate into a communicative form what the ideas are, which is interesting.
But
So
you have really big projects.
we have big projects, but sometimes we have small projects. Sometimes the projects only last a month or two. Sometimes they last many years,
Right.
depending on the size of the project that we're working on. So it's interesting. I always think that architecture is like filmmaking. Filmmaking is like a very concentrated form of
Right.
of an architectural project, and it sounds like maybe fashion is the same thing. You have a
Well, it is. I once I actually get the concept together, what I want to do, and the styles and things, I look at the big picture. So I look at how it's going to look on the runway, how it's going to look in a campaign or a photo shoot, or excuse me, the message that I want to get across. But I always see how it's going to look in the final stages.
So that's where you start? Do you kind of start by imagining what a runway show is going to look like?
No, I don't start that way. That's
No.
probably sort of within the process. It all works together. I can't really explain how my brain works, but, but yeah, I mean, and when I do produce large fashion shows or put my own together, it is like putting together a film. You're producing an event, and so yeah, you have to see the big picture first, and then you sort of work backwards, right?
Right, it's because really it's a series of very small decisions that you have to make along the way.
Yeah.
And how does that relate to the big picture? Are you constantly referring back to your vision of a big picture as you make those small decisions?
Yeah, yeah.
And it kind of goes two ways sometimes too, doesn't it? That sometimes you change the small decisions in relation to one another.
Yes, and
Yeah.
actually sometimes things happen. It's a very organic, and I guess I would think in my case, kind of a spiritual process. And so sometimes I may have an idea of something, and like the most recent collection I just did for London Fashion Week. In the 11th hour, the materials that I chose that were not leather, I wasn't able to access. So, or get when I needed them. So I had to completely change direction and some colors, but I have faith that things happen for a reason, and it ended up working better than what I had originally planned anyways. But you have to sort of have a calmness and a faith, and then that's how things are supposed to work, and they usually do.
You have to stay open and flexible.
Yeah. Oh, flexibility is,
Yeah.
I can't, yes, I have a vision in my mind of what I want to do, but I'm also, open to other options.
Well, and many things can influence the process along the way.
And you're really
Yeah.
not in total control over everything anyways, there's other people involved, and so, it would be a really horrible, stressful situation if I wasn't like that.
We have the same thing happen to us all the
I can
time,
imagine.
because sometimes we'll design a building and then 2 years later, when it's under construction, the product that we specified is no longer available or no longer in production.
Yes, right.
And you have to make decisions. But that's why, for me, it's so important to keep that idea of the big picture always hovering,
Yeah.
so that you have something to refer to when you're making the small decisions, even if they're years later.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, are the time constraints in your experience when you have to create a collection or create something very, very quickly in a matter of weeks? Is that something that you think is a positive or a negative? How does that work for you?
I think that's how I work. And so, because I have so many other things that I do that are related but not specific for design, and I am definitely a deadline geared person. And because it takes so much focus to work on, I am a great multitasker, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to actual design processes, I have to sort of seclude myself somewhere, and I have to just focus on that, which is tough for me to find time to do sometimes, but I actually need to be somewhere where I can not be interrupted. I can put all my materials and inspiration and whatever all on the floor. It's kind of a messy process. I have to have all of that stuff in front of me, and then I can work on it.
So it sounds like that's a process that's not really sustainable in the long term anyway. Like you don't have the time so in a way you're saying necessarily it has to be a focused sort of shorter time frame to. Yeah, interesting. I feel the same way sometimes about when you have too much time, you start overthinking things and second guessing yourself, and often the first ideas are the best.
Yeah, it's a very intuitive process, and it's really difficult to explain, but and it's I can't work where I can do just a little bit here and then a little bit there. It's kind of like an all or nothing kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And do you ever look back at work that you've created years ago and wonder what you were thinking, or wonder what you would do, think, oh, why did I do that, or I would have done that differently now, or?
Actually, no. I mean, I've pretty much, I understand the reason for everything that I've done up until this point. I can see a progression. It's interesting, I'm getting a lot edgier as I get older. So as I'm not...
Taking more risks?
Yeah. I'm doing things because I really like them and I don't care if anybody likes them or not. But, something that's, sort of pushing the envelope a little bit.
Oh, well, that's a nice privilege to have after all the hard work and that you've put in and your position that you have now in the industry.
Yeah.
Maybe gives you license to go a little bit further, does it?
Yeah, and it's also, inspiration the more I travel outside of the country and see, what other cities and people are doing and wearing. And then I come back to Canada and it's like, okay, let's take it up a notch.
Yeah. Yeah. I find the same thing applies to Hamilton sometimes, is that, Canada in the global realm is kind of like Hamilton in the Canadian realm, where we tend to be a little bit behind everyone else in terms of ideas and sometimes. So
unfortunately, I've guesstimated we're about 10 years behind the rest of the world.
But it creates an opportunity for a designer to really, in that context, to have maybe more of an impact. Locally.
Sure. Locally. Yeah. And it's funny, years ago I used to do a lot of shows in the U.S. And they were predominantly Western-oriented type shows, just because at that time I guess that's where they kind of slotted me. If I'm an Indigenous designer, therefore that's the Western wear world is really what they could, sort of peg me as.
Right.
So I was always doing something a little bit different. And then when I realized that the collections that I created for those shows and events, it took about 3 years here for people to, I started seeing my sort of influences or designs showing up in mainstream fashion. So I was always 3 years ahead of the curve here. And now it's even getting further. It's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So it's almost like a dialogue you're having with the fashion world.
Yeah.
A larger scale global relationship with the industry. You've talked a lot about in past interviews and things about community, the role of community in your work. Maybe you could comment on that, how community is important to you.
Well, it's I mean, the Indigenous community is very tight-knit, actually, and quite small, really, across the country. So everything that I do kind of informs, I'm trying to sort of lead the way a little bit, or pioneer what I do in a way, so that I'm hopefully providing opportunities for other young designers, other Indigenous designers in the country, that at least they could maybe see that this is a possibility for them. If I can do it, then possibly they can. And then also with the with my boutique and gallery, I'm always trying to promote and show and sell other Indigenous designers and artisans' work, maybe things that people haven't seen before. So that's my way of, supporting the community, building up, sort of a market for that as well.
And is there other levels of community? Like what about the Hamilton community or the fashion community beyond the Indigenous community?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I started an organization that is, still, in its infancy, the Ontario Fashion Exchange, about building an actual fashion industry here in the city, because there are so many great fashion designers. And the city has a history of manufacturing, and right now the Canadian fashion industry is in a crisis as far as skilled tradespeople, and factories are very few and far between now. So lots of fashion students graduating from programs all across the country, and not enough people to make things for them. So we need to really sort of start programs where there's industrial sewing training programs, and this is also what I'm trying to do, working with different post-secondary institutions like Humber College and Ryerson and Six Nations Polytech, about creating curriculum that will address those gaps, because you need to have that infrastructure in order for the industry to grow.
About making things. Yeah.
Yeah, because we used to have a viable, a major fashion industry where we had manufacturing here. I mean, this is part of the history of this country. And so unfortunately NAFTA was something that, over the last 20 years has really eroded the manufacturing sector in fashion. So we need to rebuild that, because people want, for sustainability, create jobs, but also the impact on the planet as far as fast fashion and, mass-made clothing that's disposable and ending up in our landfills. So, there's a lot we have to address.
And I guess as a designer, that would give, having a maker community at your disposal and that you're connected with would give you a lot more options and flexibility as a designer.
Oh, for sure.
In terms of experimentation, or in terms of just trying things.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talent here, and actually Hamilton already has a burgeoning makers market, not necessarily specific to fashion, but in general. So people want to make things. They want to have made in Hamilton, made in Ontario, made in Canada. And so that's growing anyway. So it's, the pendulum always swings back at a certain point.
That's interesting. So that comes back to that theme versus detail. Like making something is the epitome of detail.
Yeah.
And sometimes thinking about what it might be and actually seeing it inform one another, right? So it has to be a part of the process that can't get lost.
Yes, and then things like traditional Indigenous beadwork and handcrafted, time-honored skills have been passed down for generations. There's a whole renaissance of that happening, and which is really exciting, because there was a long period of time, maybe 15, 20 years, where young people were not learning those skills anymore because they didn't think they could make money at it. But they're now doing it on their own and creating amazing fashion pieces and jewelry and accessories, and it's really taking off again. So having those things that are special, one of a kind, when you have a market that's full of all of the same mass-made, poorly made items, people don't all want to look the same. So, it's getting back to those things, which is really exciting.
Yeah. So do you see a difference between folk art and high art?
I think it depends on maybe the environment it's being sold in, or how it's being presented sometimes. Or maybe the materials used. It's kind of it's a tough one.
Yeah, because the inspiration drawing on Indigenous traditions Many of those are folk traditions of, historical folk traditions that have lasted through many generations. And you're using that language. And would you consider yourself creating high art out of those?
Yeah. So, it's how you present those ideas and that art, I think. So one of the things that I want to see happen is, I was lucky enough in the fall of 2017 to go to, on my way back from South Africa Fashion Week, myself and another Indigenous designer were invited to Canada House in London, and they wanted, and this was part of the Canada 150 thing, so it was a cultural thing. So they wanted us to teach a group of students from the Kingston School of Fine Art who were actually working on their masters in hand embroidery. So those kinds of programs, which you have never seen in Canada before, which was really kind of cool because most of those young women who graduate get hired immediately from European couturiers. So that's a part of the fashion industry that Canada has not ever really developed or been known for. So anyways, they asked us to teach them Indigenous traditional beadwork. But as a part of addressing cultural appropriation, I said to them, I don't want to teach them our designs and patterns. I will teach them the techniques. But because they're professors and the dean of the school said right now most fashion students, and this is the same across the world, everything's off the internet. Everything's very cut and paste.
Right.
People are not they're not understanding the difference between copying and inspiration. They're just directly copying. So I said to them, what I want them to do is actually create patterns and designs of what they're going to bead look at their own cultural background, their own history, their own heritage, and come up with something that's authentic to them. And they did. And actually it became a huge project for the whole school. So they created a wall with all these pieces of beadwork and created this big mural in the school, which was really cool, celebrating cultural diversity.
So and so you found that authentic relationship between the folk traditions and making something new out of it. Yeah, very interesting.
And it was really interesting for, they were learning really technically difficult things with the hand embroidery techniques and things that, are very time-honored in Europe. They had a lot of trouble doing our techniques for our beadwork, so it was really an interesting experience.
Well, I guess sewing or making beadwork is not specific to the Indigenous community. It's been done by many different communities through the ages.
Oh yeah, for sure. And there was definitely a time when we didn't have Czech seed beads. Those were part of the Europeans coming to Canada, right? So we used quills and things like that. So, and that's also these very long-standing traditional art forms are starting to come back as well, which is really cool. But they are very, very time-consuming. So those become art or fine art. So in relation to teaching this class, what I realized is that what I want to see is that having this skill in art, doing traditional Indigenous beadwork, that it's elevated to a couture type skill.
Right.
Right? Instead of it's something that, so you sit around in a circle with your aunties and, do this kind of thing, which is definitely what art history has been. But recognizing the importance of it and that it is just as technically difficult or just as important as any other sort of hand art skill that is happening anywhere else in the world.
So it's like differentiating between the technique or looking at it as a vehicle to tell a story rather than taking the story and retelling it.
Yes, but also the level of skill that it takes. And so when you look at and that's also redefining what luxury is. And that's a conversation I've been having a lot in the last couple of years. So luxury does not just mean because it's expensive or because it has a big label or brand behind it or the materials necessarily. But luxury is also something that has inherent value and intention behind it and a level of skill that, you know, is and something that's going to last a really, really long time. So when you look at museums around the world that have any kind of indigenous articles or hand-painted items or quilled or beaded, they have lasted hundreds of years and were items that were worn on a regular basis. So in the beauty and the level of art that is involved in them, that is also luxury.
So they're imbued with a meaning that like a T-shirt from H&M doesn't have.
No, there's actually no spirit
There's no spirit.
involved
no.
in
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Well, thank you for coming in today. That was
my
really, really a great conversation. And hopefully we can have you back another day and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah,
We've been talking with Angela DeMontigny, fashion designer from Hamilton, on Strange Process. Hope you can join us next time. Thanks for watching.